UPS Flight 2976 crash in Louisville. What we know so far. Alright, as of now, here's what we know. 3 people are confirmed dead, and at least 11 others have been hospitalized after the crash of UPS Flight 2976 this evening in Louisville, Kentucky. The tragedy happened just moments after takeoff from Muhammad Ali International Airport, and when I say moments, I mean barely after leaving the runway.
So, what really happened?
Let's go step by step through the details we know so far, piecing together flight data, eyewitness footage, and what the early reports are telling us. The basics. UPS Flight 2976. UPS operates its largest air hub out of Louisville, Kentucky. That's the company's global heart for air freight. The aircraft involved was Flight 2976, operating from Louisville to Honolulu, Hawaii, a long-haul trans-Pacific cargo route that normally takes around 8 hours and 20 minutes. This particular flight was heavily loaded, not only with cargo, but also with fuel. We're talking about roughly 220,000 pounds of jet fuel, which translates to about 34,000 gallons, an enormous amount of fuel for that range. When you see the fiery explosion in the aftermath footage, that explains why the fireball was so huge and devastating. Now, the aircraft itself was a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, a trijet 3-engine aircraft that first entered service in the early 1990s. The airframe involved in this crash was built in 1991. It had a long history, typical of cargo carriers. These older jets are commonly used by FedEx and UPS after being retired from passenger service by airlines years earlier. Taxi, takeoff, and early trouble. Let's walk through the early sequence of the flight. The crew taxied out as normal. They were near maximum takeoff weight, fully loaded with fuel and freight for the long haul to Hawaii. The plane was cleared for departure from runway 17. As the aircraft began its takeoff roll, everything seemed routine. But the danger phase in takeoff, what pilots refer to as the high-speed regime, comes between 2 critical speeds, V1 and rotate. V1 is the decision speed, also known as the go/no-go point. Once you pass V1, if anything goes wrong, an engine failure, a fire, a bird strike, you can't safely stop on the remaining runway. You must take off. So, when a problem arises after V1, the pilots are committed to flight. There's no room to abort. Based on Flight Radar 24 data, this aircraft reached 184 knots at the end of the runway. That's roughly 45 knots above the rotate speed for a fully loaded MD-11. In other words, they were well past the point where rejecting takeoff was even possible. At that moment, witnesses say the left engine number 1, was already on fire. Fire during takeoff. There's a bystander video that captures the exact moment the plane's nose begins to lift. You can clearly see flames pouring from the left wing area, right where that engine sits. The video begins just after the aircraft passes V1, but before rotate speed, a narrow, tense window for any flight crew. From a pilot's perspective, that gap can feel like an eternity. You've committed to takeoff. You can't stop, yet the airplane hasn't lifted off. You're praying everything holds together. But here, something catastrophic occurred. That left engine fire erupted violently, possibly uncontained, spreading across the wing root. As the plane's nose lifted, the crew tried to rotate, but the aircraft just didn't have enough lift or thrust on the left side. Flight data confirms they left the runway at 184 knots, briefly climbing to around 150 feet. That's roughly the height of the aircraft's nose, meaning the fuselage was barely airborne, skimming the end of the runway. Then, just seconds later, the aircraft disappeared from view, and then came the explosion. The impact sequence. The next set of footage from airport CCTV cameras shows what happens after that. But the danger phase in takeoff, what pilots refer to as the high-speed regime, comes between two critical speeds, V1 and rotate. V1 is the decision speed, also known as the go/no-go point. Once you pass V1, if anything goes wrong, an engine failure, a fire, a bird strike, you can't safely stop on the remaining runway. You must take off. So, when a problem arises after V1, the pilots are committed to flight. There's no room to abort. Based on Flight Radar 24 data, this aircraft reached 184 knots at the end of the runway. That's roughly 45 knots above the rotate speed for a fully loaded MD-11. In other words, they were well past the point where rejecting takeoff was even possible. At that moment, witnesses say the left engine number 1, was already on fire. Fire during takeoff. There's a bystander video that captures the exact moment the plane's nose begins to lift. You can clearly see flames pouring from the left wing area, right where that engine sits. The video begins just after the aircraft passes V1, but before rotate speed, a narrow, tense window for any flight crew. From a pilot's perspective, that gap can feel like an eternity. You've committed to takeoff. You can't stop, yet the airplane hasn't lifted off. You're praying everything holds together. But here, something catastrophic occurred. That left engine fire erupted violently, possibly uncontained, spreading across the wing route. As the plane's nose lifted, the crew tried to rotate, but the aircraft just didn't have enough lift or thrust on the left side. Flight data confirms they left the runway at 184 knots, briefly climbing to around 150 feet. That's roughly the height of the aircraft's nose, meaning the fuselage was barely airborne, skimming the end of the runway. Then, just seconds later, the aircraft disappeared from view, and then came the explosion, the impact sequence. The next set of footage from airport CCTV cameras shows what happens after that. The crew would have had to fight that imbalance with full opposite rudder, but with such a heavy load and low airspeed, the aerodynamic control just wasn't there. Was there an engine separation? There's a circulating image showing what's reportedly the number 1 engine sitting on the ground near the departure end of the runway, still burning. This hasn't yet been verified by UPS or the NTSB, so we have to treat it cautiously, but if true, it's a major clue. If that engine detached during the takeoff roll or rotation, it would have ripped open part of the left wing, ignited fuel, and destroyed lift on that side. The left engine's fire might have already weakened the wing structure before it broke away. In that scenario, with the left side losing thrust and lift while the right engine pushed full power, the plane would naturally roll left. The crew would have had only seconds to respond, not enough to regain control, especially at low altitude. This matches what we see in the CCTV footage. The aircraft tilted sharply left, one wing high, the other cutting through structures before disintegrating in flames. The fireball and fuel load. The intensity of the post-crash fire wasn't just because of the impact. Remember, this flight was loaded with 34,000 gallons of jet fuel, more than double what a 767 typically carries on a coast-to-coast passenger flight. For comparison, the aircraft that struck the World Trade Center towers on September 11th carried around 10,000 to 13,000 gallons each. UPS 2976 had nearly 3 times that amount. So when the MD-11 hit the ground, that immense fuel load turned it into a firestorm. Reports from Reuters and other agencies suggest the plane may have also struck a fuel storage facility beyond the runway, intensifying the blaze. The fire burned for hours, with flames and smoke visible miles away. Helicopter footage from later in the evening showed a continuous trail of burning debris and fuel stretching almost a mile beyond the runway threshold. A heartbreaking scene. Why the MD-11 has a history of trouble. A quick note on the MD-11 itself. When it was introduced in the early 1990s, airlines saw it as the next evolution of the DC-10, faster, more efficient, and with longer range. But the design had issues. The MD-11 was notoriously difficult to handle during takeoff and landing. Its long fuselage and center-mounted engine made it pitch-sensitive, and cargo carriers have experienced multiple serious accidents over the years. When I started flying in 1991, the MD-11 was the brand-new pride of the fleet. But within a few years, many passenger airlines phased them out because of maintenance headaches and handling quirks. Cargo carriers like UPS and FedEx took them over. They were rugged, long-range, and could haul huge payloads. But when fully loaded, the MD-11 operates close to its performance limits. On a long route like Louisville to Honolulu, that margin becomes razor-thin. Analyzing the data. Let's look at what the flight tracking data tells us. According to FlightAware and Flight Radar 24, the aircraft began accelerating normally, with airspeed increasing smoothly. Then, just as it reached the runway end, it hit 184 knots, and its altitude momentarily peaked at roughly 150 feet before dropping. There's no evidence of a rejected takeoff attempt, meaning the crew did not try to stop. They were committed, airborne, but losing lift. That single data point, 184 knots, tells a lot. At that speed, if the airplane was still on the ground, it would have been well past any possible stop distance. So the pilots made the only decision they could: keep climbing. Unfortunately, the aircraft simply couldn't maintain lift. Moment of impact. The CCTV footage that surfaced later shows the final seconds. The plane, engulfed in fire, appears to skim low over a line of industrial buildings. Then it clips one roof, bursts into a fireball, and disintegrates as it slides across the ground. The left side of the aircraft digs into the ground. That's likely the wing or landing gear, while the right wing, with its engine still running, is visible for a split second above the fireball. That angle explains why the wreckage trail extended so far. The plane was literally carving through the landscape, sliding almost on its side. Aftermath and damage. The post-crash scene is almost indescribable. Photos from local responders show multiple buildings destroyed, vehicles burned, and debris scattered across a huge area. The fire was so intense that rescue crews couldn't immediately reach the main fuselage. Authorities say at least 11 people on the ground were injured and taken to hospitals. There are still reports of unaccounted workers in nearby facilities, and search operations continue. The 3 pilots on board, the captain, first officer, and relief pilot, were all killed instantly, what investigators will look at. Now that the fire is largely under control, investigators from the NTSB, FAA, and UPS safety team are on scene. They'll begin by securing flight data and cockpit voice recorders, the black boxes. They'll also study the engine debris, especially the left engine area, to see if separation occurred. The ADSB data, to confirm airspeed, altitude, and heading changes. The fuel system, since an uncontained fire points to possible ruptures or line failures. Maintenance logs, since the MD-11 is an older aircraft that may have had prior mechanical issues. UPS and the FAA have said it's too early to speculate officially, but the preliminary evidence points strongly toward a catastrophic engine failure and fire occurring just after V1. Why this crash was so devastating. Several factors came together in the worst possible way. Timing. The failure occurred just after V1, the point when a takeoff can't be aborted. Weight. The aircraft was near maximum takeoff weight for an 8-hour flight to Hawaii. Fuel load. With 34,000 gallons of fuel, the energy on board was enormous. Engine failure. A severe fire or separation destroyed lift on one side. Low altitude. At less than 200 feet, there was no time or altitude to recover. It's the kind of scenario that even the best-trained flight crew can't escape. Comparisons and context. For context, the UPS MD-11 fleet has been in service for decades and is generally reliable, but it's had several notable accidents involving control loss on takeoff or landing. Cargo flights are usually flown at night, with fewer people around, which may be the only small mercy here. If this crash had happened during the daytime, when airport workers and nearby businesses were fully staffed, the casualties could have been far higher. Closing thoughts. At this point, we know that 3 dedicated UPS pilots lost their lives in the line of duty, and several people on the ground were seriously hurt. This was a catastrophic mechanical failure that unfolded in the most dangerous possible window of flight, a few seconds between liftoff and disaster. When dawn breaks, investigators will have a clearer view of the wreckage and, hopefully, answers about what went wrong. It's hard to watch the footage, the flames, the explosion, the sheer violence of it. But understanding what happened matters, not only to honor the lives lost, but to make future flights safer. As more information becomes available from official sources, the NTSB preliminary report, radar analysis, and flight recorder data will have a clearer picture of why UPS Flight 2976 never made it past the skies of Louisville tonight. For now, all we can do is keep the crew and the affected families in our thoughts and wait for the facts to come in.